When working with MBD, you can define default tolerances for your tolerant dimensions on your model. Onshape provides many of these out of the box, including several ISO standards, which are based on ranges of dimensions. For example, up to 3 millimeters, we add a plus or minus zero point 0.2 millimeter tolerance. Up to 6 millimeters, we add a plus or minus zero point 0.3 millimeter tolerance. Onshape also provides a precision-based tolerance. And when we choose this, you can see that this defines a tolerance based on the number of decimal places. This one, however, is based on imperial units, and there's actually just a conversion to metric taking place here. So we want to create our own default tolerances for metric. We're going to show how to do that. Let's go ahead and let's exit out to our company's root level folder. Now, most of this will be the same regardless if you are a standard, a pro, or an enterprise customer. We'll mention the differences as they appear. The first thing you need to do is you need to create a new document to define your default tolerances. My company's name is Epic Design, so we'll call this Epic Tolerances. In this new document, we don't need the assembly studio, so we'll go ahead and delete this. We will want a part studio for defining our default tolerances. Let's actually go ahead and create a model so that we can see our tolerances as we create them. So I'm going to go ahead and create just a simple block here. And then we're going to go ahead and add some dimensions. A tip for adding dimensions that will contain tolerant information is to dimension line to line, or any edge that will ultimately create a face, because that's what's actually being defined with MBD. So in this case, we're going to specify that this is 90 millimeters wide. We're going to enable the tolerance options checkbox and press OK. We'll do the same thing here for the depth. We'll make this 150 millimeters, and again, enable the tolerance options and press OK. Then we'll go ahead and extrude this and enable the same checkbox. Notice, nowhere did we actually need to create any special dimensions for MBD. We just utilize our standard sketch and feature dimensions for MBD. If we want to see those, we simply activate the inspection tab over on the right-hand side, and those dimensions appear. But notice that there's no tolerance information applied to those. So that's the next step. Let's create the actual tolerance. And we do this using a variable studio. So we'll go to the plus icon in the lower left and choose to create a new variable studio. We will name this after our tolerance. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and rename this and call this metric, and it's precision based that we're going to be creating. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck the insert into all part studios and assemblies, and I'm actually going to leave this variable studio blank for now. We'll see how this gets filled in a moment. Going back to the part studio, we're going to select our default tolerances. And again, we can see the default Onshape tolerances, but if we go to the current document, the variable studio we just created now appears in this list. I will point out we could create multiple default tolerances within the same document. However, for this example, we're just going to create this one. When we do that, we get a couple of warnings, and that's because there's no tolerance information within the variable studio yet. But we're going to use the Edit Default Tolerances button to define that information. When we click this, we're presented with a dialog where we can choose to add a tolerance type. Let's start by adding some linear tolerances. If we wanted to do range-based tolerances like we saw in the standard ISO default tolerances, we could add those here. So for example, up to 3 millimeters, we can make it plus or minus 0.3. Up to 6 millimeters, we can make it plus or minus 0.5, and so on and so forth. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that because what we want to add is a precision-based tolerance for our linear dimensions. Once we select this, it will present options for decimal places up to 6. So let's go ahead and enter some of these really easy values. We're going to start with 1 decimal place. That's going to be plus or minus 0.3. 2 place will be plus or minus 0.1. And 3 place will be plus or minus 0.05. At this point, If you wanted to use more than 3 decimal places and maintain a plus or minus 0.05 tolerance, you would actually have to enter that information again and again and again. You could likewise, if your company doesn't use decimal places over, say, 3 place, you could simply remove these rows from this default tolerance, which is what I am going to do. Now, if I were to specify that a dimension has 4 place decimals, no default tolerance will actually be applied to it. I will use this as a warning that my default tolerance standard doesn't support 4 place decimals, and I may need to choose a different number of decimal places or manually define the tolerance for that dimension. Likewise, if we have no decimal places, maybe we want to set a tolerance here. We could actually leave that blank if we needed to. And then finally, our workspace precision. This is when we're designing in 3D. Typically, you're not changing the number of decimal places on each dimension to define its tolerance. So we can set the default here. Now, typically, I would have this match the standard tolerance I want to use on my model across the board. For me, that would be 1 place. So I would make this 0.3. However, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to make this 0.4 so that you can easily see these tolerances later on. Now we can add additional tolerance types. For example, I want to add a tolerance for angular dimensions. And again, I could use precision-based, but in this case, I'm going to just use a constant value. All of my angles are always plus or minus half a degree. No more, no less. Unless, of course, I manually create a tolerance for that dimension. Additionally, we could add a default tolerance for fillets. For example, the tolerance on these may be much looser than a standard 1 or 2 place decimal. Again, I'm going to use a constant tolerance. And to make this really easy to see on any fillets, I'm going to make this half a millimeter. It's so much larger than what it typically would be, but this should make it obvious. There's a few other types. You could add specific tolerances for the angles and distances on chamfers. And custom class is specifically for custom features that are created with feature script, which we won't cover in this demonstration. Let's go ahead and press save. And once we do, we can see that those default tolerances appear over in the panel on the right-hand side. We can also see that those tolerances have automatically been applied to these dimensions. Notice they're using the workspace tolerance of plus or minus 0.4 millimeters. Now notice if I were to double click on this and expand a dimension, I could change the precision from workspace, for example, to 2 decimal places. And once I do that and close this sketch, we can see that that now uses the plus or minus 0.1 millimeters, which we defined for 2 place decimals. So this is one way you can go through and set your tolerances. You can have a generic tolerance that you use for the entire workspace precision, and then set individual dimensions like you would in the days of 2D drawings if you wanted. So we've created our tolerances. The last thing I want to show is what did we actually do with this edit button? If we go back to the variable studio, we can see that we've actually created some fairly complex information here, which we wouldn't have wanted to type manually. This is why we use the edit tolerance button in the part studio. It makes it much more readable and easy to modify. The other thing we need to do is we do need to create a version on this document so that this information will be eventually visible. So let's go ahead and create a version. You can give it a custom name and description if you want. I'll just use the defaults here. Okay, so we've created the tolerance. We now need to make this visible to the rest of our organization. Well, still at the top level of your organization, we're going to create a new folder. Now, if you are working in an enterprise, it's important that you use a folder here and not a project. Let's go ahead and give it a name. We're going to call it tolerances. This is going to work very similar to how our frames work. You can see we have our frame profiles stored here. Our tolerances are going to go in a folder just like this as well. We need to have a document within this folder to set it as a library. So let's go ahead and simply drag and drop that Epic Tolerances document we just created into that folder. This folder also needs to be visible to the rest of our organization. So I'm going to go ahead and share this folder with all of our enterprise users. We want everybody to see this, but we don't want everybody to edit it. The one thing you need to make sure is that you have the link document enabled so that the users can link to this. Also, don't forget to click the share button here. If you miss that step and you get warnings about the folder not being shared, this is likely the step that was missed. We'll go ahead and close that. And the last thing we need to do is simply right-click on the folder, choose to set it as a library, and here you'll see that we can set this to, just like we can a frames profile library and a sheet metal forms library. You can see that you can create a default tolerances library. Now there are two options here. There is one for myself and one for my organization, and I want to set this for my entire organization. So notice that the icon changed to match the same icon used for our frames profiles library. And the last step you need to do is right-click on that folder once again, and then you want to make sure that this is set. And so it is all set. I don't need to change anything here. I was just double checking to make sure. And let's go back into that bench vise we looked at the beginning of this video. I'm going to turn on the inspection tab again. We can see all these dimensions. And we're going to disable the default tolerances we had previously defined. And now when we go to the default tolerances, you can see that our company's default tolerances now appear, and the metric precision-based tolerance that we had defined now appears in this list. When I press done, I'll collapse the individual dimensions. We can see the linear tolerances we defined, the constant angular tolerance, and the fillet radii. Here you can see a fillet dimension utilizes the plus or minus 0.5 millimeter. Here it looks like I changed this to a 3 decimal places to appear in this case, and this uses the default workspace tolerances. So we can see that it's been used across the board. Hopefully this was helpful in getting your organization set up using your own default tolerances in Onshape.